Okay, now that we've gotten situated with ourselves, you will be divided into 6 groups of 4. 2 groups will be doing the same points, and we will be having 3 main points. There will be the point of view, the clarity of themes, and the importance of literary devices being used. And to start off, I'm going to go ahead and show you what an annotated example is from one of the previous students from the previous classes, where they chose to highlight many of the key points that were important to them. So even if it was casual, where it's like easily and naturally putting in some key phrases there, saying naturally, what does that have to do with anything related to the story? How does this impact the main ideas? Lots of full phrases, what it means based on the theme of the narrative, what kinds of contexts are being spoken. They were basically writing down comments for themselves to remember what to be using afterwards. This is a good example of when you were assigned to do your annotated examples for Soldiers Home so we could get comfortable with the reading. This was one of the popular ones that lots of students would prefer to use as an example to help them when they would prefer to see what they would need to highlight or what they would feel comfortable with having. This is just a preliminary example that many students like to use, but that also means that your own annotations that you made are perfectly fine as well. If you highlighted the same things, if you didn't highlight it, that's perfectly fine as well. But I just wanted to go ahead and point out that these are some examples of some of the things that a student would choose to highlight. But that's also good for you as well as in groups, because since you will be working in groups, you will be doing group thinking, which means that you will be getting your own ideas that you already have and putting them together and collectively coming up with the examples and supporting your ideas to the class when the discussion time is up between the groups, which means that going on into what we're actually going to be discussing within your groups, you will also be focusing on the 3 points, as I've mentioned, the point of view, literary devices, and clarity of themes. This means that the groups that we will be discussing, point of view, will have to focus on what kind of perspective it is. Is it first? Is it third? Is it omniscient? Is it limited? What can we figure out from Greb? What can we figure out from Kreb based on what is written down? How is his character identified? Are other characters identified the same way? Is the narrator being visual about everything? Is the narrator making their point of view very limited? Are they being very dull? What kind of use? What kind of use is Hemingway making of the point of view that he has? Most certainly, the Soldier's Home reading was third person, but it was probably not limited, but it could be. And if it would be, what would be something that would prove that? What would be something that in your group you could collectively find within the reading that it proves that it could be limited or omniscient? That's something to focus on. And then there's also the purpose of the point of view. As I just mentioned, there is a reason why Hemingway wanted it written in a certain way. Every author has their own way of putting something in. They all want to share the same kind of reasoning. They all want to share a story. They all want to share an idea. Why would Hemingway use this point of view as his main theme? And it's how is important to a narrative, not just for Hemingway, but for Kreb, the character that is living in the world that Hemingway built for this character. And what kind of evidence shows this point of view? Where would we find this in the text? Where would it be? One of the key ways of figuring this out is when you go through and you realize what kind of writing is in what kind of point of view, that's when you will know. Third person is usually they, she, her. First person is usually I, me, my, which means that lots of it will come from what kind of um, dialogue is being used and what is being described. Just as his lies, his everything is written would be in third. And that's good to use because that way you're able to focus on what you want to prove through those third person point of views. Moving into literary devices, you will be focusing on the literary terms that you learned in your handout from previous lessons that you should have with you on hand as well. And that means that what devices are easily noticed, which are hard to find, which are very repetitive, which aren't repetitive, what's one that you notice that is only used like once and then it's not repeated again, which is used the most, what makes it so important, Why would Krebs need to be using this kind of dialogue, this kind of narration, and why would it impact the narrative of Hemingway's Soldier's Home? How does this support Krebs' perspective? How would a war veteran feel coming back home? Lots of it has to do with feeling like an outsider, being alienated. Then that means that the narrative will probably have a very passive tone, or will probably be needing some repetitive ideas or thoughts that Krebs is feeling, since lots of it has to do with personal emotions and impact of the device used. It is not placed randomly. Most of the time, it won't be, which means that there is a reason for everything, which means that a lot of the repetitive words like lies or lots of the passive voices within the dialogue has to do with something. Even if some of the literary terms that you were learning in your handout is not visible in this reading, it doesn't mean that there isn't any other. If you notice something that wasn't from the handout, that's perfectly fine to use as well. Make sure, and if you need any clarifying of what this term means, then go ahead and check in with your other group mates. They might know how to support you or how to better those ideas. And then the last two groups, you will be focusing on the clarity of themes. Where does Hemingway build his ideas? What was Krebs supposed to represent to the story? How does the story represent the return of a war veteran? What does the narrative prove to the reader? Who is an example of Krebs' family that shows how the theme is being used? Lots of this is about surrounding characters, surrounding ideas, the setting. This is more of an overlapping um, conversation because a lot of it has to do with picking from different parts. Clarity of themes means that you're figuring out all the little key points and how they fit together to make one big narrative, one big story, one idea to share. And lots of it has to do with Hemingway's own experience with war. And this could be just any random veteran story, but it also means that there is some sort of overreaching idea that Hemingway wanted us to focus on. It could be more than just what I've mentioned, more than just isolation, more than just being a veteran, more than just not being a hero, more than just a spotlight that isn't shared. Lots of it has to do with the changes one person goes under, coming back from something that they weren't sure they were going to come back to. And then it's also mentioned that in the beginning of the story, Krev also realizes that he didn't come home the same time as the rest of his friends did. He didn't share that coming home phrase that other people would have had. That is also important to understand within the theme of what Krev is feeling and what kind of life he lives now because of that change. All those minor details are what put the themes back into place. They're the key parts that you need to memorize. And a lot of it also has to do with what you were able to annotate the night before. Since all of you will be in groups of 4, there will be the leader, the timekeeper, the reporter, and the participant, which means that once I am finished discussing this with you, we will have about 30 to 35 minutes. It's okay if it goes through the end of the class. We will wrap it up when possible, but that also means that each of you will have a task in coming up with something and creating those supporting texts that you have come up by yourself, but also make sure that you connect better with your teammates so that you have proper supporting ideas and examples and textual evidence that you know can help further your discussion point when you share with the class. Lots of these points will connect with each other, and hopefully that means that Soldier's Home will be a very collective idea for all of you, and you'll gain a better understanding because these could be used as possible theses that you would have in future reference for a paper, possibly at the end of the lesson or the unit. There's no knowing yet, but that also means that each of you are tasked to focus on a smaller idea and tasked with the bigger thinking. Lots of it also has to do with making sure you analyze properly and that you use your annotated notes just as I have shown you here, similar to the ones that you should have on your own desk. Which means that now that we will be going into your mini group discussions, make sure that you do a lot of proper communication and you spend a lot of time working with your teammates and making sure that lots of your ideas get shared properly. And if you have any questions, just go ahead and raise your hand and I'll go ahead and go to your team and see what I can do to support you without putting too much pressure on you. Okay? Sounds good. Now you can go ahead and get into your discussion groups, and I'll go ahead and set the timer.